In the history of modern popular culture, when you say the word secret agent or spy, one man comes to mind. That man is, of course, James Bond, 007, Licensed to Kill, created by the British intelligence officer Ian Fleming in his now legendary series of books and subsequent films. And in the natural desire for legitimacy and to add credence to the fantasies of every young man, many people have suggested that Britain's dashing, roguish rake from MI5 is actually based on a real person, the most famous nominee being the late and great Sir Christopher Lee, while others have put forth everyone from Ian Fleming himself to a number of renowned secret agents of World War II. Yet I think, after all these years, I have finally found the man who bears the closest resemblance to the famous on-screen secret agent. The man we are going to talk about today is a man Ian Fleming almost certainly would have met. A man of action, a hit with the ladies, an incredible gambler. But the interesting thing is where I found him, because I found him in the last place you'd expect. The RAF Museum in London is a marvellous place, full of aircraft from every corner of the earth that have seen service in the most titanic clashes of war in the air throughout all of history. Yet none is more mythologized and exalted in RAF history than the Battle of Britain, to which the museum has an entire exhibit dedicated. With Europe conquered by the fascist war machine of the Axis powers, the United Kingdom was staring down the threat of invasion by Hitler and the Nazis. All that stood against them were the young men and women of the Royal Air Force who, over the summer of 1940, would confront the Luftwaffe in perhaps the most decisive battle in world history, with the very concept of freedom itself at stake. It's a story that gets told and retold across all forms of media with varying levels of drama. And it probably has more myths and legends perpetuated about it than any other major battle in history. And of course that results in endless documentaries being made, including on this very YouTube channel. Yet despite being a cornerstone of the modern British national identity as their finest hour, half of the few who saved the many were not from the isles they so valiantly defended. Rather, they came from all the nations of the world, uniting together against an unspeakable evil that for so many of them had seized their homes and murdered their loved ones. The Polish heroes in 303 Squadron, who became the highest scoring unit in the battle, are the most famous, but they are hardly the only ones. You have the Americans in Eagle Squadron, the Czechoslovaks of 310 Squadron, an assortment of Frenchmen and Belgians, collectively being immortalized in the Sabaton song, The Aces in Exile. And of course, that's not to mention the Commonwealth aviators from across the Empire, ranging everywhere from Canada to South Africa to Palestine, and naturally, the Anzacs. Even some Republican Irish pilots volunteered to take a stand and fight for what was right. Except when you visit the exhibit at the RAF Museum or check the page related to international pilots on the website, there is one nation represented there that seems extremely out of place. Tacked on to the end without much fanfare is a single pilot from a very unlikely country, that country being Austria, which those well versed in the Second World War history would rightfully find confusing, considering that Austria was at the time part of the Third Reich. And it was this very fact that intrigued me. Who was this man who went against his home and family? Who was this enigmatic fighter pilot that, despite being someone of obvious historical note, no one has really even talked about? I checked on YouTube, I checked on Google Books, I checked everywhere, couldn't find anything about him. You'd think that such a unique story would have been told in detail somewhere, and that someone like me would have already heard of him and made content about him. But when I looked him up, his wiki page is only a couple of paragraphs long. No movie, no best-selling books, no documentary, nothing. Which is insane, because the only thing crazier than his obscurity is his career. Because I am convinced, after buying a very expensive physical copy of his exceedingly rare biography, as in, there was only 4 for sale across the entire globe, he may just be a contender for the title of the main character in World War II. And that's despite his competition with legends like Hans-Joachim Marseille, Jack Churchill, or Leo Major. This man was an Austrian nobleman, an ace fighter pilot and prolific womanizer, a fast-living and faster-driving wild card of a man who became a legend not only for his heroics in the air, but deep behind enemy lines as one of the most successful secret agents in the Special Operations Executive. That's right, this man was a fighter ace and a spy. And that man's name is... Hold on. Sorry, this is actually a bit complicated because I gotta get like a sheet because his name is like really long. Hold on. There it is. This man's name is Graf or Count Manfred Maria Edmund Ralph Becket Czernin von Chudenditz. Yes, really. That's his full name. And today, I'm going to tell you his absolutely incredible story. But first, as always, we must thank the sponsor. And if you want to maintain your security from an unauthorized person like today's hero, this video's sponsor, NordVPN, can help. Look, by now you all know what a VPN is, you don't need me to tell you, but in my personal opinion, Nord is the easiest to use, exceptionally efficient, very affordable, and definitely the most versatile. They have servers all over the world, giving you access to practically every piece of content available online. Their website contains every piece of information as well as the resources required to guard your privacy while browsing. Their plans cover multiple devices with a dedicated app for every device, and this app can share data and files using their meshnet system with the other devices. And as far as security features go, it comes with a dark web tracker, comprehensive anti-malware, and browser protection, all backed up by 24/7 customer support. Simply put, they are an affordable, easy-to-use, and practical VPN, and I have used them for half a decade now. Plus, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee in case you don't agree with me. So click the link in the description and get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan when you sign up. It helps me, and it will help you. Thank you to Nord for the sponsor. Now back to the video. On the 18th of January 1913, a child was born in a small medical clinic catering to the nobility and wealthy, residing in one of Europe's greatest imperial cities. The jewel of Prussia itself, Berlin. The parents were both aristocrats. His mother, the Honourable Countess Lucille Catherine Becket of Grimthorpe, was the daughter of a baron and a noblewoman in her own right. She was also an academically published scientist, an accomplished philosopher, and a socialite of legendary renown. She knew just about everybody. D.H. Lawrence, Greta Garbo, everyone. Yet the boy's father, somehow, was someone of even greater societal and historical importance, as his father was Count Otto Rudolf Theobald Ottokar Czernin von Chudenditz, senior official in the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Office and serving ambassador to the Russian Empire during the lead-up to World War I, known as the July Crisis. Yeah, he was the guy handling communications between Emperor Franz Josef and Nicholas II when it all went down. He also held senior rank in the Austro-Hungarian army and would later serve on the general staff during World War I and eventually end up as foreign minister. As the saying goes, he was kind of a big deal. Oh, and if that wasn't enough to be getting on with, the baby's godmother who attended his christening was no one significant, no one really important. She was just some noblewoman from the Balkans. Her name was Crown Princess Maria, the last Queen of Romania. And at the christening, he was bestowed the name of a warrior and ruler from the 11th century, renowned for his gallantry both on and off the battlefield, King Manfred of Sicily. What I'm trying to say is, just short of actually being a prince himself, Count Manfred von Czernin is a nobleman as you can get. An aristocrat of the highest order, born to an Anglo-Austrian family in the capital of the German Empire. Though he was the fourth of 4 brothers, so his title would be the furthest thing from his mind growing up, until suddenly it wasn't, but we'll get to that. As you can probably guess, however, there is a slight issue with the dates that I've just given you. He was born in January of 1913, his father is Austrian ambassador to Russia, and his mother is a British noblewoman. He had arrived at a very awkward time. Relations between his parents had already been strained, always travelling to far-flung foreign posts for his work, and when not doing that, they were constantly attending formal engagements. For a mother to be constantly separated from her husband, and quite frequently her sons, this would make things very difficult. And after years of this, the growing tensions between the family, as well as their respective countries, forced them to officially separate in March of 1914. Custody of the children was contentious, but it was eventually decided that the 3 older boys would stay with their father as they were all to be enrolled in Austro-Hungarian military schools, as was the observed tradition of the day, while the youngest, being practically a newborn, was to stay with his mother. Not wanting to stay in Austria, Lucille decided that the best place to raise Manfred was somewhere where he could grow up away from all the regimented and restrictive life of the European aristocracy. Thus, she couldn't very well go back to England, a country practically defined by its class system, so instead she decided to move into her family's summer home, a luxurious coastal villa in the town of Ravello, known as Villa Cimbrone, overlooking the Gulf of Salerno in Italy. Just so we're keeping track, Manfred was born in Berlin to an Austro-Hungarian count who was ambassador to Russia and a British noblewoman scientist who is friends with some of the most famous and powerful people in the world, and he is now growing up in southern Italy. Kid isn't even able to walk yet, and he's already more cultured and well-travelled than most people ever will be in their entire lives. Of course, this retreat to Italy had one tiny little flaw. Technically, Lucille was still married to Count von Czernin, and Italy was an affiliate member of the Entente Alliance, meaning that she was still an Austrian citizen. It would be a serious problem if something should happen that would cause war between the two countries. I mean, there is news of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand going on a trip to the Balkans this week. I mean, surely nothing bad will happen. I mean, he's going on a trip to Sarajevo. Oh dear. The outbreak of World War I divided the family along concrete lines. Countess Lucille and her son Manfred were officially enemy aliens. However, thankfully, being the renowned socialite that she was, not to mention British nobility, she was personal friends with the British ambassador to Italy, who appointed her to a diplomatic post, coordinating Red Cross aid to soldiers and war relief efforts to refugees displaced by the Alpine battles in the north of the country. But the Countess had an even greater job, raising her son. And despite being her only family that she could actually see at the moment, she had chosen to take the hands-off approach, partly because she believed young men should face life independently to learn how to fend for themselves, and partly because she had absolutely no chance of controlling him anyway. Because from all the primary source accounts of his childhood, Manfred was an absolute terror of a toddler. If there was a large tree, he would climb it. If there was an even larger dog, he would go to pet it. From his very earliest days, it was apparent that Manfred had a natural affinity for animals. The entire village of Ravello considered his villa's guard dog particularly fierce. Manfred, all of 2 years old, crawled up to the dog while his nanny wasn't looking, and just hung out with him, giving him neck scratches. Needless to say, as long as that dog was around, Manfred was the safest kid on Earth. This reckless behaviour naturally also continued into his schooling. According to one of his classmates, the local Italian kids considered him the class hero, as he was behind practically every joke they ever pulled. Every prank, every class disruption of varying magnitude, most of it was his doing. The grandest of these shenanigans being trying to storm the stage while the high schoolers performed that year's school play. He didn't get away with it, but apparently it was quite an epic attempt, with him actually climbing the front of a full-size stage. Keep in mind, he's like 4 years old at this point. That thing is a full 1.5 feet taller than he is. Homie had to jump to try and make that. And shenanigans like this, as we will see, would continue well into his adulthood. But for the moment, a critical decision was thrust upon his mother, as World War I ended with Austria's defeat, leaving her husband and sons essentially adrift in their homeland as the empire they swore loyalty to was no more. And Lucille, despite having now formalized her divorce, had promised Count Otto that Manfred would return to his brothers after the war ended. However, with the empire's collapse, the Count made a magnanimous and eventually historic decision. The boy had grown up in Italy and his family were English. Though he was Austrian nobility, it would be far better for him to grow up with that position in the world's last standing superpower, rather than a broken-down, defeated nation falling to ruin. So, in 1920, Manfred was brought to the English coastal town of Folkestone, where he was enrolled in a boarding school for young boys, while his mother organised a full-scale move, upon the completion of which she would select an alma mater for him, most likely being the famous Eton College. When she returned to Italy to resolve all the remaining affairs, her teenage sons joined her on their school holidays to help out with the move and see the mother they hadn't seen in over 5 years. Except things were not at all well in Italy during the interwar years. Sectarian political conflict had broken out throughout the country, as Mussolini's black shirts began clashing with the various communist movements cropping up among the urban proletariat. This would, as we know, eventually lead to the March on Rome, installing Il Duce as dictator. But despite what the propaganda of the time suggests, it was far more difficult for the fascists initially, which would have tragic consequences for the Czernin family. While driving from Florence to Ravello, they were stopped outside the town of Viterbo by a squad of communist militia. They advised them that it was off-limits to outsiders due to potential fascist incursion. Lucille tried arguing, stating that their hotel was just inside the city limits and they would just move on in the morning. But the officer commanding the guards was having none of it. Seeing the futility of arguing with men holding guns, Lucille got back in the car, did a U-turn and went looking for a ring road to find other lodgings. No sooner had she done this, the communists opened fire on the car from the city walls, the guard post, and an ambush position nearby. Her second eldest son Jaromir was shot through the head, killed instantly by the impact of the round. Her eldest son Paul took one through the knee, shattering his kneecap and severing an artery. It was only through a quick tourniquet and an amputation from a local surgeon that saved his life. Edmund, the third brother, survived just barely, after a round went through the side window right past his face, showering him in broken glass. Immediately pulling over to render aid to her horribly wounded sons, she screamed at the communists to hold their fire, repeating, "You've killed my son! You've killed my son!" over and over. The officer who had questioned them ordered his men to cease fire and ran over to render assistance. What had happened was a tragic miscommunication. Due to the recent hostilities bordering on civil war, fascists in the area had been using female drivers to evade checkpoints and smuggle militants into communist towns. Word of this had been passed down to the local garrison, who immediately assumed her angry departure was the sign of a blown mission, and so they opened fire. Needless to say, both these events, and what would become of Europe later, engendered a lasting disdain for both communists and fascists alike among everyone in the family, especially Manfred, which quite honestly is a total mood that keeps getting stronger day by day. However, with the two older brothers dead or disabled, combined with the very complex European inheritance laws common to the nobility, this would eventually lead to Manfred receiving the title of his father's holdings in Czechoslovakia, albeit he would receive them in name only, given that nation's recent change to a republic, meaning that throughout high school and later life he would often be referred to jokingly as the Count, a nickname he would share in a much similar vein to one of his future enemies in the Luftwaffe, Walter Krupinski, and they shared it for the exact same reason, as both were supposedly noblemen who behaved anything but nobly. The trauma of losing her son and the chaos in Italy delayed his mother's return, but by the time she had made it back to England, the enrollment period for Eton College had already closed. Luckily though, a very highly recommended school for the gentry in Peterborough was still open for applicants. Oundle School, which at the time, and to this day, was one of the highest performing schools in the United Kingdom. Once he started his schooling, Manfred again proved to be exceedingly popular among his classmates. Throughout his entire education, he had a reputation for being the life of the party, as well as the one who caused the most trouble. His best friend from those years, in an interview for his biography, later said that the class all collectively agreed that if there was anyone in the school most likely to get expelled for shenanigans, it was definitely Manfred. However, Oundle School was also a haven for some of the more refined parts of society that other schools didn't focus on. The experimental curriculum at the school meant literally every single extracurricular activity that could be thought of was practiced, a tradition the school continues to have to this day, and one of the biggest of them was music. Manfred was a natural savant at music, mastering both the violin and the piano in short order, to the point where after only 2 or 3 years, he could play Bach's violin and piano concertos from memory. This also turned him into a vinyl bro before such a term existed. If a new piece of audio tech came out, he had to have it. Radios, gramophones, and later record players. All of them had to be top of the line in his house. But it wasn't just music. He was also a very athletic guy as well. He was on both the rowing team and the cricket team, later becoming a member of the Marylebone Cricket Club, England's elite cricket association and the owner of Lord's Cricket Ground in London. And of course, while he was doing all of this, he was also in the school's cadet program, or JROTC for you American viewers. You can see the picture forming here. This was a young man who raged against the machine, despite in fact being part of the machine, which had predictable results on his academic performance, which was entirely average. Though it was obvious to everyone that it was only average because he hated being cooped up in the classroom and found academia to be utterly boring, rather than a lack of intelligence. Because every time final exams came around, he would walk in, get one of the top marks in the class, and then walk out again, smoking a cigarette against school rules in the yard out back. He would graduate from school in the highest form of his grade, but he still had to take his certification exams, which at the time were the equivalent of the UK's current O-levels. British education is kind of weird. Basically, you could graduate, but to actually get certified for higher education and other accolades, you had to take an exam right at the end. And Manfred had just about had enough of school life, and he sure as shit wasn't going to university, despite his mother's protestations to the contrary. So, if he wasn't going to Oxford or Cambridge, as custom would dictate, he needed to get a job. And it's here the final piece of our puzzle named Manfred falls into place, because his mother was no longer Lucille Beckett Czernin. No, she was now Lucille Beckett Frost. His mother had remarried, and the man she married was Captain Oliver Henry Frost, Order of the British Empire with the Military Cross, formerly of His Majesty's Royal Flying Corps. Manfred's mother had married a fighter pilot from World War I, who naturally told him stories of his exploits and his adventures, planting the seeds in his mind for the future. And as a kid who refused to have training wheels on his bike out of pride, the idea of such a career was too much to pass up. Except he was still too young to sign up for the RAF, and the RAF had been suffering through the interwar budget cuts, so pilot slots were limited. Thus, his stepfather set him up with an engineering apprenticeship in the hope he would take a liking to the job and choose to study it full-time, thereby appeasing his mother in the process. He did well at the position, actually, developing a talent for operating all things mechanical as well as fixing them, especially fast cars. But the academic professional side of the business once again didn't appeal to him, resulting once again in him being without a vocation and a job. And being a man of the nobility, this left one option open. His mother once again pulled some strings with her fellow aristocrats and through them got in touch with a family friend out in the colonies, one Colonel Valentine, who owned a tobacco plantation in the sunny savannah of Rhodesia. No, stop it. Stop it, all of you. Albanian princes, FALs and booty shorts aren't a thing yet. Besides, their drip is literally the only good thing about them. This was still colonial Rhodesia. He set off for the city of Umtali, modern-day Mutare, in the southeast of the province. On his arrival in the country, by sheer fate, he ran into Colonel Valentine's eldest son, Sandy, who convinced his father to take Manfred on full-time for the long term after Manfred impressed him. And so, for the next 2 years of his life, Manfred helped run the plantation, learning accounting, business management, and some good old-fashioned hard work, something that had been absent from his life thus far. Yet the type of work he was doing here really did suit him. His skill with animals was exceptionally useful when a roguish stallion, unable to be broken by any of the ranch hands, was easily tamed by him within a few days of his arrival. Turns out, when working on a ranch, being good with animals is a very useful talent to have. Eventually, though, he would have to receive a reality check and pursue a proper career. And that reality check came in the form of an absolutely crippling bout of malaria, forcing him to return to England with his mother to convalesce. And Manfred hated this. He had just been in Africa, going on safari, meeting the majestic and beautiful creatures of the world's wild continent, working a job he had a talent for, warm days riding horses, and going on daily adventures of either business or pleasure. And now he was back on a dreary little island that rained 2/3 of the year and snowed for the rest. The moment he recovered enough, he resolved to get the hell out of England. Wise move, in my opinion. He and his mother went on a grand tour of Europe, visiting all the great musical conservatories, museums, and art galleries throughout, eventually ending up in his ancestral homeland of Czechia, touring the grand old city of Prague. But of course, he overdid it, and put way too much stress on his body so soon after surviving a life-threatening disease. His health was touch and go constantly, and like all men, he refused to ever go to a doctor unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then, it was 50-50 whether he would heed the advice of the doctor or not. So, when his stepfather Oliver asked him to be his co-pilot for the famous Monte Carlo car rally, a grueling mountain race requiring extreme physical and mental focus, despite having relapsed into his condition with a fever that was astronomical, Manfred enthusiastically agreed to come along. You heard correctly. While suffering from a case of life-threatening chronic malaria, he hid his illness, locked in, climbed aboard their Lancia Augusta Roadster, and won the goddamned race. Now this is crazy enough, reckless, and quite frankly stupid. But do you know what's dumber? Thinking to yourself, ha! I won the race, that means I'm perfectly fine. Time to learn to ski again. Which then results in him attempting to go on a skiing expedition, only to pass the fuck out halfway up a mountain and be carried back down on a stretcher straight into a hospital bed like the dumbass he is. A bed which he would stay in for the better part of a year. And like all 20-year-olds who stay in bed all day, I used to be one, Eventually, and inevitably, the parents would start yelling, "Get a job!" He needed discipline. He needed a purpose. He needed one grand adventure better than any other to keep him out of trouble. And both he and his family knew exactly what that job would be. In April of 1935, Manfred showed up to RAF Uxbridge for his induction into the RAF, which, like everyone else, involved drill instructors with impeccable mustaches and pacing sticks making his life miserable for 6 weeks. As a public school boy with cadet experience, though, he knew exactly what he was in for, and once again he worked just hard enough to pass in the top third. But only just enough so he could get to the flying. And on May 14th at RAF Netheravon, he found himself standing with 3 other cadets, staring at an Avro Tutor training aircraft, waiting for his instructor to show up, which very presently he did. One flying officer, David Alvey. Quickly scanning the cadets, he looked at Manfred. "Right, what's all this? Oh, morning, Beckett. You first. Feeling alright?" With a nervous nod to the affirmative, the instructor pointed to a parachute sitting on a chair nearby. "Righto then, lad, put that on and make damn sure you tighten the leg straps properly. We don't want an accident to turn you into a waff." The image of his parachute opening in order to save his life, only for the straps to slide up and crush his testicles into oblivion, was not a cheerful one, so he did as he was told. That done, he climbed awkwardly into the front cockpit and sat down. He then began scanning the instrument panel in front of him. He was trying to remember what all the gauges in front of him did when the crew chief jumped up on the wing next to him to check his chute and his harness were fastened properly. "All okay, sir?" Manfred gave a thumbs up, and the chief disappeared. It was then a voice came through the speaking tube in front of him. "Right, Beckett, watch the instrument, see what I do with the controls, and for God's sake, don't touch anything unless I tell you, okay?" Manfred, like a complete moron, nodded a response. His instructor was sitting behind him, and he couldn't see his head behind his jacketed helmet, so the instructor had no idea he answered him. "Okay. Oi, you listening?" Manfred soon realized that he was an idiot, and acknowledged verbally. And a minute later, after watching one of the students in the class above him do a landing that would make Ryanair or Spirit Airlines proud, his instructor opened the throttle, and into the skies they went. This moment was life-changing, floating through space, wispy clouds flying past, life's greatest adventure. The essence of freedom was right in front of him. After they landed, he made the first entry in his logbook, the first of very many. From here, his progress through training was fast, and while it wasn't distinguished, he nevertheless passed every test given to him. Where he did stand out, though, was his popularity. His fellow pilots found him funny, friendly, and the best companion. It also helped that being from the upper crust, he had a fast car that they could take into London for weekends of drunken debauchery and various shenanigans. A beautiful Wolseley Hornet 4-door. It also had another advantage. Lots of room in the back for other activities, something that Manfred was also apparently very adept at. He had several girlfriends, among which was another officer's wife who was apparently exceedingly attractive, though it seems that the guy was cool with it as he was sleeping with yet another man's wife. Man, swingers have all the fun, don't they? Suffice to say, Manfred was among his peers an absolute legend. Eventually, on February 5th, 1936, he passed his final exam and qualified as a pilot in the Royal Air Force, posted to 57 Squadron flying the Hawker Hart, a 2-seat high-performance fighter bomber. Later transferring to 83 Squadron and into a more advanced degree. He flew escort for the Royal Yacht on an official visit to Ireland, but that's about it. However, while not distinguishing himself, he would become notorious, and like his mother, a masterful networker. Manfred met and got to know every single senior officer. However, my finances aren't as considerable as a European aristocrat's, so if you want to help me out, like and subscribe, share the video where you can, and if you want to financially help the channel, you can either donate to my Patreon, or you can use promo code JDAM at checkout for your next Gamer Subs order. Thank you very much. Carry on. So he didn't need to get a job right away. He hung around playing cricket at the MCC, he played the violin, he went for drives in the countryside. His life was, on the whole, all quite civilized. And that was the problem. It was too civilized. He needed a new adventure. So he decided on an adventure. That being an epic gap-year journey across the entire United States, New York to California steel ball run style, driving and horse riding from coast to coast, partying it up all the way. With his fearless demeanour and cavalier attitude, he also demonstrated an aptitude for gambling, turning a tidy profit as he went. A profit he would put to good use after he returned back to England, because while in America, he had discovered something else on his adventure across the New World. He had discovered the hamburger. And not just that, American cuisine as a whole. Manfred von Czernin was going into the restaurant business, setting up shop in the red light district of Soho in London, granting it the illustrious name of the Hot Dog. Despite being a talented musician and consummate bullshitter, he apparently wasn't that creative. Either that or he had an immaculate sense of irony. Going into business with his best friend Alwyn Bolton, they sought out an experienced businessman in the hospitality industry to make it work. Except they had no idea how to actually run the place, nor did they have the expertise to accurately replicate American cuisine. Not to mention the fact that the avalanche of American popular culture had yet to fully conquer the world, so the food of the American working man didn't exactly strike a chord with the English middle class, while his establishment was not exactly geared towards the clientele the cuisine was designed for. It would be like opening a premium burger joint serving craft beers in the 1980s. Forward-thinking, sure, yet too far ahead of its time. They tried leveraging Manfred's connection to the rich and famous, which worked a little, but not enough to offset their expenses. So, seeing as they were in Soho, he and Alwyn decided to turn their eatery into a basement bar, which they called the Alibi. Which, in fairness, is absolutely hilarious. Only now they were competing with the other 100 or so bars in Soho with established customer bases. As a result, it was nothing more than a hangout for his crew. Eventually, they had to sell up shop, which suited Manfred just fine, as now he had even bigger problems. Manfred had made the cardinal mistake. He'd fallen in love. While buying fine china for his now failed eatery, he walked into his supplier's store to pick up the first set of plates and cutlery when he bumped into an old family friend escorting a young lady by the name of Maud Hamilton. From the moment they met, the two instantly became drawn to one another. It was almost love at first sight, as tired a trope as that sounds. He was still a womanizing, hard-drinking, gambling dilettante, but he really liked Maud and she liked him. Her parents, however, did not. Not at all. A playboy pilot from the aristocracy, a failure in business, and nothing but trouble. It also didn't help that her father knew his father, Otto, and therefore knew he was an Austrian by birth, and World War I wasn't that long ago. So they took a family trip to Switzerland over the year of 1939, while Manfred went with his family to Italy. And there they would stay, until Manfred had to return to the RAF for his 2 weeks reserve service to keep current on active RAF aircraft types. And the month he returned was the second half of August 1939. You all know what happens next.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. And that consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
With the outbreak of war, Manfred immediately married Maud despite her parents' disapproval. After all, either he or she could be dead within a year, and like so many other wartime marriages, they decided it was best to act fast. It also had an added bonus, as the married status allowed Manfred to live in quarters with his new wife off base, as opposed to living in a barracks on the airfield. And his first posting came as soon as the war began, assigned to the ferry pilot's pool at RAF Hucknall. He enjoyed the work at first, given the fact that Germany was busy with Poland. He got to fly everything from Ansons to Tiger Moths to the various bombers currently in service, including the worst aircraft the RAF has ever commissioned onto its flight lines. Ugh. The ferry battle. Look, ferry aviation has a lot to answer for having built both the worst and the ugliest aircraft the RAF has ever fielded. They are lucky the Swordfish practically sunk the Bismarck. That gets them a pass, though just barely. But after a while, Manfred got bored. Furthermore, he was afraid that having been in Bomber Command prior to the war, despite him flying fighter bombers, that he would end up flying Wellingtons or Blenheims or something. So naturally, being a nobleman, a man of means, and having maxed out his charisma stat, he walked right into the office of the nearest fighter command group commander, demanding a transfer. And the group he happened to be in was 12 Group. So, for perhaps the only time during the entire war, Air Officer Commanding Trafford Lee Mallory actually made a good decision, approving the request subject to qualification by a fighter instructor. Having multiple years of flying experience, Manfred naturally qualified easily with a score of above average, subsequently undergoing conversion training to the Hawker Hurricane with 504 Squadron RAF before transferring to 213 for fighter training, practicing scrambles, interceptions, and carrying out coastal patrols. Yet Manfred desperately wanted combat, and the Germans were already clashing with the British Expeditionary Force's aerial contingent, so he asked for a transfer once more to a unit already in France, 85 Squadron RAF, and on the 9th of May 1940 he arrived on station the day before Germany launched their all-out offensive. And as tomorrow dawned, 85 Squadron flew into combat against the Luftwaffe's assault on the Low Countries. Manfred, being an older pilot at age 27 and new to flying fighters, had to push himself as hard as he could just to stay alive. His colleagues shot down 11 enemy aircraft the first day of combat, while he flew as a wingman, barely keeping pace. He had a close shave with a Bf-109 during the first dogfight, getting away with it barely, only to get utterly blindsided in the next battle by another one. Seriously damaged, he had to make an emergency landing at a friendly airfield close to the front lines. Communications were down due to shelling and the chaos of the Wehrmacht's blistering pace of advance, so he couldn't phone home. Now this normally wouldn't be an issue. He'd just have to hitchhike with some rear echelon army guys back home and report in. Except his absence was a cause for concern, for reasons that one might understand. An Austrian pilot breaks formation and then seemingly disappears just as the Wehrmacht launches an all-out surprise attack? But surely his background would dispel any such suspicions, right? Well, you see, Manfred, as we know, is a popular guy. The life of the party, as it were. But if you recall, I also mentioned one other title he possessed. He was an unparalleled bullshitter. If there was a chance he could prank someone by convincing them he tamed lions while he was in Africa, or that his noble ancestry dated back to the courts of Charlemagne or something, he absolutely would. And when he joined the squadron, he naturally had to explain his Austrian last name to his fellow pilots. So obviously, he was a Luftwaffe defector, an ace over Poland, who came to hate the Nazis after witnessing their monstrous crimes. Thus, he valiantly changed sides and joined the RAF to fight back the fascist invaders. Naturally, everyone in the squadron had a good laugh and, got to know the real reason why he was there. But those of us who've grown up in the meme culture of today know better than anyone that a satirical joke can very quickly spread to humorless individuals. Humorless individuals in command positions. When Manfred got back to base, he was put under guard and ordered to explain himself. Which of course he did, though naturally it took him off combat ops for the next few days. That, and he also needed to get his plane fixed, seeing as he'd gotten it shot up. So it wouldn't be until May 19th, a full week later, that he would get back into action properly. Yet he would make his comeback in spectacular style. While carrying out a frontline patrol at around 20,000 feet, 85 Squadron ran into a massive formation of Heinkel 111s, escorted by an entire wing of Bf-109s. Following his leader into the attack, Manfred dove right into the middle of the formation, dodging fire from the defensive gunners as he did so. Calculating his speed and heading, he picked out a victim among the formation and took aim. But he didn't shoot. Not yet. He waited until he got close. Until eventually, closing in, he depressed the trigger. The HE-111 lurched to the right from the 8-303 machine guns, slamming into its starboard engine, causing it to erupt in flames. But Manfred wasn't done. Touching the rudder to the left, he lined up on the port engine and fired again, setting that one on fire as well, causing the bomber to start plummeting down as it burned. Very soon, parachutes started blossoming below him as he climbed back up, trading his speed for altitude. That was his first ever kill, but he didn't have time to think about it. Firewalling the throttle, he looped over the top and came back at the formation, picking out the rearmost bomber. This time he came in from above and behind, raking his fire down the entire length of the aircraft with his remaining ammunition. The crew inside was torn to pieces, and without men at the controls, the bomber nosed over and slammed into the ground with a catastrophic explosion. 2 kills in 2 minutes. Returning to base, he reported his 2 kills and then went to grab some lunch. But his meal would soon be interrupted, as orders to scramble came through just as they'd finished rearming the aircraft. A Geschwader of Dornier 17s was making its way to the city of Lille, and they had to head them off before they could smash the city's rail yards, crippling the logistics in that sector of the front. Manfred, a half-eaten sandwich still in his hand, ran to his Hurricane, strapped in, and took off to intercept. It didn't take them long to find the formation heading for their target. They were approaching them head-on at a considerable closing speed. This time, Manfred was leading the attack. Picking out one of the bombers in the first flight of the formation, he dove in, all guns blazing. A full broadside of incendiary tracer rounds passed through the fuselage and into the bomb bay, detonating the payload. A catastrophic explosion blew the aircraft apart as Manfred's Hurricane pulled up out of its dive, only to then wing over and immediately pursue another Dornier. The rear gunner opened fire at him, but it was already too late. Manfred pressed down on the gun button and sent a burst of fire into the turret, killing him instantly. The Dornier then began a tight left turn to evade, but there was no way a fully laden bomber could outmaneuver a fighter saddled up in a firing position. Manfred placed his crosshairs about 20 degrees in front of the port engine and fired. His deflection shot was perfect, causing the Dornier's left wing to burst into flames and shear clean off, sending the aircraft plummeting down until it spread its wreckage over the French countryside. 4 kills in one day. And 4 kills in one day is an impressive feat for any pilot, but for an older-aged rookie, it was nearly impossible. What was more impressive, though, is the fact that he made ace the very next day. 85 Squadron was sent out to strafe German troops advancing on Arras. Being from a noble family, he had toured the French countryside often throughout the years, which resulted in him being assigned flight lead, seeing as he'd be able to navigate the area and find the most likely lines of advance the Germans would use. Sure enough, Manfred spotted a column of German troops, complete with armoured vehicles and half-tracks, moving at a considerable speed. And scouting ahead of the column was an HS-126 Army Cooperation plane. Diving into the attack, he sent the biplane down in flames on the first pass. With that task done, he pulled up, rolled back in, and picked out several troop trucks in the middle of the convoy. Once more, he dove in and let loose with all 8 guns. The Germans abandoned their vehicles and ran for it. The Hurricanes made several more strafing passes, but the Wehrmacht, as part of standard doctrine, constantly moved light flak units with their forward elements, so on the third pass the AAA fire drastically intensified. Manfred's wingman took a direct hit and went in, exploding into a fireball across the ground. This explosion started a chain reaction, setting off a fuel truck, which then exploded with an ammunition truck, in turn taking out the other member of the flight who was flying in trail directly over the convoy. His Hurricane was thrown inverted by the explosion, sending him crashing into a nearby field. As Manfred had led the attack, the initial fusillade of fire was aimed directly at him. Flak units weren't really trained in deflection shooting at this stage, so the rounds meant for Manfred instead hit his wingman flying behind. He had gotten extremely lucky at the tragic expense of his comrades. By May 20th, 85 Squadron had shot down 89 enemy aircraft at the cost of 9 of their own pilots killed. An impressive score to be sure, yet they had not been able to receive any replacements. Thus, the squadron was withdrawn back to the UK for rebuilding under command of the famous Group Captain Peter Townsend, while Manfred transferred to his new unit, 17 Squadron RAF. The Battle of France was rapidly turning into a disaster. The Wehrmacht broke through in the Ardennes forest following the famous sickle cut strategy, isolating the entirety of the Allies' elite forces in the Low Countries and northern France. The British Expeditionary Force had withdrawn to the port city of Dunkirk to carry out a rapid evacuation to prevent their total annihilation. And Manfred's squadron was once again in action, fending off the Luftwaffe's attacks on the armada of ships below. Now this is usually where stories about the Battle of France end, with the British making their desperate escape in little boats crewed by civilians that heroically came to the rescue. Yet the Battle of France continued for another 3 weeks after that in an operation the Germans called Fall Rot, or Case Red, and 17 Squadron RAF would be redeployed to western France in order to compensate for what amounted to the near destruction of the Armée de l'Air, while covering the withdrawal of all remaining British troops in France from Cherbourg and Saint-Malo. Arriving at Le Mans airfield on June 9th, Manfred immediately began flying patrols. It was hard going over the next 2 weeks as the advancing Wehrmacht forced them to move around all over the place. While covering Allied troop ships evacuating from Le Havre, Manfred and his wingmen ran across a flight of HE-111s, beginning an attack run on the fleeing ships. Clearing their tails to make sure it wasn't a trap, the 3 Hurricanes singled out a target each and dove in to engage. Manfred shot his target to pieces, seeing parts fly off into space as it went down through the cloud layer in an uncontrolled dive. The rest of the flight shot theirs down, with 1 pilot scoring 2, making a total of 4 for the squadron that day. The pace of combat was intense. Constant combat air patrol missions were flown to protect the evacuations, and as a result, there were several serious dust-ups with the 109s, with only one engagement resulting in a victory when they got the drop on them. But the kills weren't able to be confirmed as the Germans broke contact the moment they got shot up. The stress of combat was mounting on the pilots of both sides, which resulted in numerous shenanigans in order of relieving it. To get the Luftwaffe perspective, I humbly recommend my series on Hans-Joachim Marseille, who I mentioned earlier, and the hijinks the men of 17 Squadron got up to were no less insane. For you see, during the British forces' retreat from France, the priority was naturally preserving lives, as trained manpower is far more valuable than equipment. So when they pulled out, most of the gear was left behind. This included their vehicles. And the RAF pilots were based at Le Mans Air Base. I think you can see what happened here. After tactically acquiring stockpiles of cigarettes and whiskey, they then went roving among the BEF stockpile of abandoned vehicles and quite literally stumbled across an entire platoon's worth of dispatch riders' motorcycles. This had the inevitable and expected outcome. These too were also acquired and hastily brought back to base, where they immediately were tested on the world-famous Le Mans 24-hour circuit, as 17 Squadron's pilots raced each other at top speed with no safety equipment while drinking hard liquor. Look, it had been a rough week. They weren't exactly thinking logically. And it only got rougher still. The German advance was devastating as they rolled through the French with little to no resistance, despite the heroics of the French trying to hold the line. They took Paris on the march as they advanced. So the RAF had to fly from field to field, refueling and fighting as they went, sleeping under the aircraft overnight. Eventually they ended up on the English Channel island of Jersey, with Erwin Rommel's tanks on the opposite shore, before being evacuated back to RAF Debden, northeast of London. And with that, what General Weygand called the Battle of France was over, and the Battle of Britain was about to begin. In the early phases of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe was still reorganising after their victory over France. As established in the previous chapter, while the victory, their casualties were considerable, and the advance of the Wehrmacht was so rapid they didn't have the infrastructure in place to support a full-scale air campaign against the United Kingdom. Funnily enough, the French had built all their large, well-equipped air bases near the German border, and given that Hitler was now on a sightseeing trip in Paris, I'm comfortable in making the assessment as to why. So the Luftwaffe would have to carry out a more conservative strategy while they rebuilt their strength and set up air bases, allowing them to deploy their entire force across the English Channel. Thus, the strategy decided upon was an anti-shipping campaign over said channel. The idea being that if we bomb the supply convoys heading to London, along with the southern English coast, the RAF will have to come and defend them. Then all we have to do is send up all our Bf-109s over at high altitude and shoot down the British pilots over the ocean, thereby denying them the home field advantage, thereby winning the war of attrition. Now this didn't work, of course, as Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding saw right through this strategy. But potential bad optics in the press, as well as basic human decency, meant he couldn't exactly leave the convoys undefended either. So, Fighter Command would mount standing squadron patrols over shipping throughout British waters, 6 to 12 aircraft providing cover, with the goal of breaking up the enemy formation, reducing their bombing accuracy, without overcommitting resources to their defence. And 17 Squadron was regularly assigned to this duty over Dover and throughout the Thames estuary. It was boring work with not much action in their sector, though they did get some success here and there. During one patrol, while covering a convoy with the call sign Booty, yes, 17 Squadron were deployed to protect the booty, Manfred and his wingman, Pilot Officer Hansen, engaged a formation of bombers from Kampfgeschwader 2, working together to shoot down a Dornier 17, while their comrades in Red Section splashed a Heinkel and another Dornier. All in all, July was a very boring month for the men in 12 Group RAF Fighter Command. What little fighting there was took place down in 11 Group sector on the southeastern coast, and when the Battle of Britain properly started in August, 12 Group's job was to cover 11 Group airfields and patrol the Midlands, meaning for the first week of fighting they didn't have much to do. However, that would change very quickly, and it still didn't stop Manfred's shenanigans. While out at dinner with his wife and their dog Cairo, who was an absolutely incredible dog by the way, just look at him, he was wearing his everyday RAF uniform, which had been appropriately modified to reflect his ace pilot dash and daring. His top button was undone, tie a little loose, silk scarf in obvious evidence. When a journalist having dinner at the table opposite them noted his appearance in detail though, he saw that Manfred had, against all regulations, sewed on the dress uniform buttons of multiple air forces that he had collected from the pilots he'd flown with in France. Seeing the opportunity for a fluff piece in the local paper, The journalist came over to talk to him about himself and the squadron, what the story was with his buttons and other little trivia here and there, what the boys defending Britain are like on the home front, that sort of thing. But Manfred, being Manfred, saw the perfect opportunity to fuck with a journalist, which is an opportunity no veteran will ever pass up. Ever. So he told the reporter that he collected these buttons during his flight from Czechoslovakia. He was in the Czech Air Force, only to flee to France when the country was invaded. Then, during the campaign in the Low Countries, he worked as a liaison with the Dutch and Belgian air forces, desperately trying to hold the Germans back, alas to no avail, tragically having to retreat, though he scored 8 victories in the process. Eventually, he ended up in the RAF to valiantly carry on the struggle to free his long-lost homeland for democracy and the glory of the British Empire. It was a fantastic load of bullshit. Including the victory tally, because officially he'd only been confirmed for 6. In telling the story, Manfred had decided to add the probable scores he saw go down through cloud cover on top of his official tally. And of course, the story was taken as read, as it was naturally rather juicy. And so, when the resulting article hit the newspapers, his squadron mates in 17 Squadron found the whole thing incredibly funny. The issue was, though, their friend had gotten famous. And as someone with a successful YouTube channel, I can confirm this firsthand as a victim of it. If your friend gets famous, the official rules state that you are required by the bro code to give them as much shit for it as possible. So they decided, if Manfred was going to be a rock star, if he was going to be the big hero, they would make him a national icon. Just to fuck with him. For the sole purpose of messing with him. The entire squadron, all the officers, the commanding officer, the ground crews, everyone, wrote a joint letter to the newspaper saying that not only was he a veteran of 5 air forces, the reason he was on leave is because he'd actually shot down 18 planes and he was just being modest. Also, he had actually joined the Allies because Hitler personally seized the famous Czernin palace in Prague, worth £1 million, which of course, given his family name, he was the owner of, etc., etc. You get the idea. And once again, journalists who, like in our own time, never ever fact-check, published all of this across the nation. The roasting Manfred got from everyone was well-deserved. In fact, the roast was so ruthlessly merciless that they had a special medal made for him with Cairo's head on one side and the award name on the other. The award name being the Line Shooter's Medal, which translated from RAF slang is a decoration for being an elite bullshitter. And they went all out. They held a full ceremonial parade with the entire unit in attendance to award this completely made-up medal, which you can see being awarded right here. As you can see by the smile on his face, I think I can say confidently that he realised being hoisted by his own petard is extremely funny. What wasn't so funny is the sheer panic at the RAF Public Relations Department, who launched a full-scale investigation into how they apparently had an Austrian triple ace who'd 1v1'd Hitler on the real estate market that apparently nobody knew about. It was a great moment that came just at the right time, because for the next month, smiles would be rare. As the Battle of Britain raged down south around Dover, 12 Group flew patrols and intercepted the occasional recon flight. They only occasionally saw action. But it was 11 Group that was taking a serious beating. The only combat that Manfred saw during the second week of August was when his flight scrambled to intercept a lone Ju-88 probing the radar network in the Midlands. Leading Red Section into the fray, Manfred and his wingmen dumped all their ammo into the singular German aircraft in a coordinated attack at point-blank range, sending it plunging into the North Sea. Other than this one incident, it was a whole lot of waiting around, staring at the dispersal telephone. A constant tension, only broken by either scramble or stand down, and it was an awful lot of stand down rather than scramble. It was then that they received orders to redeploy to Tangmere on the south coast of England, relieving what remained of a unit that had taken a serious beating. 17 Squadron was now on the pointy end of the Battle of Britain, and on August 25th, 1940, they would find out just how bad things really were. As the pilots sat by their dispersal hut that morning, it was a tense experience. As always, they had gotten used to waiting all day, only to end up flying standard patrols. And that was if they flew at all. This time, however, it was different. No sooner had they finished their first cup of tea, halfway through their morning cigarette, the phone rang. Scramble! Bandits 100 plus heading for Weymouth. over 100 Luftwaffe planes in formation and at altitude. 17 Squadron sprinted to their Hurricanes and took off as fast as their Merlin engines could carry them. Manfred, leading Yellow Section, formed his flight of 3 on Red Section's right and followed his squadron leader into battle. It wouldn't take long. After being airborne for less than 15 minutes climbing up through 18,000 feet, a calm though slightly unnerved voice called out through the radio. Hello leader, bandits, 10 o'clock high." An entire wing of German fighters, half Bf-109s, half Bf-110s, were storming towards them at high speed. Almost 40 enemy aircraft in all. Manfred didn't hesitate. He opened up full throttle and turned head-on with the enemy, following right behind Red Leader who'd done the same. After closing to within firing range, both sides started shooting nearly simultaneously. Manfred, picking out a Bf-110, fired a short but very accurate burst into the front of the aircraft. The wild incendiary tracer rounds of his 303s caused a secondary detonation in the enemy's ammunition while igniting the fuel tank. The Bf-110 went down in a ball of flame, with the wreckage narrowly missing Manfred as he flew past. The squadron leader, meanwhile, went head-on directly with another Bf-110, but neither flinched, resulting in a catastrophic mid-air, killing both crews instantly. This left Manfred in command of the formation, but by now it was a furball. It was every man for himself. Without thinking, he looped over the top after the first pass and began chasing the remaining Bf-110s down. The Hurricane is far more agile and easily turned inside the twin-engine fighters, putting them on the defensive before they could react. Immediately, one of the German pilots saw Manfred coming and desperately tried to turn head-on, but he couldn't make it in time. Another accurate burst of machine gun fire shattered the cockpit, killing the crew, while starting a fire in the radio compartment. This Bf-110's wingman, seeing what happened to his flight lead, tried to break away to run, however he was nowhere near fast enough. Manfred looped over once again and dropped right on top of him, emptying the remainder of his ammunition into the starboard engine. Smoke poured out of the aircraft, while the asymmetric thrust caused him to enter a spin. The engine caught fire while the G-forces pinned the crew in the aircraft, rendering them unable to bail out. It exploded on the beach in a sheet of flame. In less than 10 minutes, Manfred had shot down 3 Bf-110s, which in of itself is an incredible feat of airmanship. Yet his wingmen were no slouches either. 17 Squadron lodged a claim for 13 enemy aircraft shot down in that engagement, with their only casualty being the commanding officer. Manfred's heroic effort on this occasion resulted in him winning a real medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was now Flying Officer Count Manfred von Czernin, DFC. And from here on out, things would get insane. Because in September, the Luftwaffe would launch their final wave of attacks on RAF airfields, followed by a full-scale assault on the city of London itself. And throughout that time, 17 Squadron would be at the forefront. On September 3rd, there was a huge battle over RAF Debden, their usual home base. And according to the recounts of several pilots, it was an absolute total clusterfuck. One giant furball of Messerschmitts and Hurricanes with no cohesive organization whatsoever. It was basically a bar brawl in the sky. Manfred shot down 2 in the engagement, while several of 17 Squadron managed to knock down 1 apiece. But it wasn't all one-way traffic. A third of the British planes were either shot down or completely totaled with battle damage. Thankfully, the pilots all made it. And the fights just kept coming. Every single day they went up and did battle, with Manfred scoring a victory every 3rd mission or so, while sharing in the destruction of several more with his wingmen. On September 15th, which is today known as Battle of Britain Day, the largest single day of aerial combat during this period saw 17 Squadron joining the fray against wave upon wave of German bombers. Though, ironically enough, they had one of their rare bad days on September 15th, due to the fact that everyone else had a very good one. There were very few opportunities for them to get involved, instead having to square off against the German fighter escorts. Eventually, though, Manfred's luck was, like everyone in combat, due to run out. And in the waning days of the Battle of Britain, on November 17th, 1940, he would make a terrible tactical error. A tactical error that not many people have lived through. On that day, 17 Squadron was scrambled to defend RAF Martlesham against a flight of Bf-110s from the elite ground attack unit EG-210. And once again, Manfred dove in with his usual disregard for personal safety and led his flight head-on into the formation in order to break it up and make it easier to pick off the stragglers. When the fight began, he did a fast loop after the first gun pass, latching onto the tail of the lead Bf-110. It didn't take him more than 3 seconds before he lined up a perfect deflection shot and sprayed his guns along the entire airframe, setting the aircraft on fire. But, in launching this attack, he had made said grave tactical error. He hadn't checked his tail before engaging. And the Bf 109 squadron above him was none other than Jagerschwader 26, led by none other than Adolf Galland himself, future commander of the entire Luftwaffe fighter force, as in the head of the entire German fighter force. Seeing this ultra-aggressive Hurricane shoot down his lead bomber, Galland immediately decided to remove this troublesome Englander from existence. Diving down with his Daimler-Benz engine screaming, Galland lined up on the target. Manfred saw him at the last second and jinked out of the way, but it only delayed the inevitable. A one-sided duel followed, with Manfred barely hanging on. He tried everything. Reversals, stalls, he twisted and turned, he gave Galland a run for his money. But he had, inadvertently, though entirely on brand given his fearlessness and, to be quite honest, reckless stupidity in combat, picked a fight with the best pilot in the German Air Force at the time. However, unlike many men who made this same mistake, he had the opportunity to reflect on his stupidity while floating down in his parachute, his burning Hurricane slamming into the field below him. Though, despite being incredibly lucky to get away with this, perhaps the funniest part of this whole episode is him having to explain his name to the men of the Home Guard when he landed, presenting his identification only for them to see the name von Czernin. Naturally, this caused a bit of concern. His perfect British accent, though, is what saved him. They wrote him off as a Czech or a Pole from the diaspora who learned English in Britain. Which is, you know, not too far from the truth, actually, but having a Lee Enfield with a bayonet stuck in your face while explaining this is probably not a comfortable situation to be in. When he got back to base, however, he was greeted with a hero's welcome, and to celebrate his survival as well as their new squadron leader's wedding, the pilots got together and put on an air show for the local villagers by roaring in low over the town and the parish church, doing aerobatics and generally making an aerial nuisance of themselves. The Battle of Britain was over, and by the end of it, Manfred's score stood at 15 air-to-air victories personally, 6 more shared with other pilots, and another 5 more seriously damaged. He was a rarity among Allied pilots of World War II. He was a triple ace. But there was also something else unique about him. He was, as they say in the business, old as fuck. Compared to all the other fighter pilots around who had been born just after World War I, he'd been born before it, and his older age meant he was scheduled to be rotated out of the front line to an instructor or staff position to make way for younger and fitter flight commanders with faster reflexes. And so, after a trip to Buckingham Palace to receive his DFC from King George VI personally, a ceremony which included Louis Mountbatten getting his DSO, by the way, he was put on notice that a promotion was very soon to come through. For the first half of 1941, the winter limited flight operations in Europe as it always did. It's cloudy and windy over Europe during the winter. Amazing, that. That meant that everyone got some much-needed downtime, which was a good thing too, because in May of 1941, Manfred's wife Maud announced that she was in labour with their first child, a daughter. His presence was therefore required and, well, let's be blunt about this, demanded. He was to return to London immediately for the birth. Naturally, Manfred dropped everything and applied for immediate leave, which was granted because, well, nobody was really doing anything. Yet as he arrived in London on the 10th of May, the first welcome he received was not from his loving wife, but rather from the Luftwaffe, as they chose that night of all nights to launch the largest raid of the London Blitz up to that point, with several hundred bombers hitting the city with an avalanche of incendiary bombs which very nearly started a firestorm. But let me ask you, dear viewers, what do you think Manfred did? Did he run to his wife as soon as possible to meet his newborn child? No, of course not. Because Manfred, as we know, is a certified gigachad. What he actually did was find the nearest volunteer fire brigade and join their crew, fighting fires around St. George's Hospital for the entire night, saving a number of lives in the process. When he did finally link up with his family the next morning, his mother, quite understandably, gave him a royal chewing out, asking him what the hell he was thinking running into a firestorm on the day of his first child's birth. To which he replied, "Why worry about it? If there's a bullet or bomb meant for you, it will get you no matter what you do." Anyway, after spending some time with his new family, his leave came to an end and he had to be reassigned. The RAF really didn't know what to do with him at this point, so they just started shunting him around all over the place. He flew as an instructor at 52 Operational Training Unit. He was acting squadron leader of 65 Squadron for a week until a new CO could be found. Then they moved him to 222 Squadron, where he again held down the fort for a week until the actual commanding officer arrived. He was essentially a substitute squadron leader in the Greater London area until the end of 1941, where he eventually ended up at 41 Squadron. And it was here he flew his last major combat sortie of his fighter pilot career. On February 12, 1942, the Kriegsmarine attempted to run down the English Channel with their surviving major capital ships, the gruesome twosome Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, with Prince Eugen along for the ride. Later known to history as the Channel Dash, it was the largest sea and air engagement in the English Channel until D-Day in 1944. On that day, Manfred covered the naval bombers that attempted to attack the battleships near Dover. The dogfight his Spitfire squadron had with the Bf-109s was intense, with Manfred claiming a probable on one of them. He had been flying operationally since 1939, almost 3 years of constant flying, and now he was 29. Once more he was reassigned, this time to a maintenance testing unit. But something had happened a couple of weeks ago which ultimately changed his career trajectory in a far easterly direction.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Imperial Japan was on the march throughout the South Pacific. All of Britain's best pilots and aircraft were needed to hold the Luftwaffe at bay in the Mediterranean and North Africa. RAF Far Eastern Command was chronically under-supported, their aircraft were obsolete, and their pilot numbers exceedingly low. If only we had a reserve pilot with tons of experience, especially on a lot of the older RAF aircraft types. Maybe a guy who flew in a ferry unit and saw combat. You know, a guy who could really whip them into Wait a minute, we have just the guy. Assigned commanding officer of 146 RAF, Manfred was transferred to India in March of 1942, arriving at the end of the month in the Assam province. The aircraft he had on strength were an assortment of obsolete aircraft. Hurricanes, Brewster Buffaloes, most of them older models and short on spare parts. They also got a shipment of old P-36 Hawks, designated the Mohawk by the RAF. On the whole, their inventory were completely outclassed by the Japanese. But they were quite literally the only fighter unit in the entire region, so they didn't have much of a choice except to crack on and do their best. For the next 6 months, Manfred led his ragtag unit against the long-range Japanese nuisance raids launched against military bases in India. Yet due to their slower machines, the Mitsubishis were usually gone by the time they arrived on station. His squadron occasionally did achieve some success, but due to his role as the leader, he was more often doing paperwork and filing combat reports with headquarters rather than actually going flying. He didn't get the chance to score any kills on Japanese bombers despite his every effort to do so. It really was just bad luck that he never got the chance. Eventually, news came from home that his first son Nicholas was born, and he was very happy at this, but he was also very sad. Manfred really wanted to be there. He wanted to be a proper fighter pilot again. He hated being a bureaucrat. He was a squadron commander in an office. He had done everything in his power to avoid higher responsibility, and now here he was at a dead-end posting with obsolete aircraft, filling out paperwork, while the Japanese spent all their time fighting in the Solomons instead. In fact, they had this bizarre fascination with the place. Apparently the Americans were on this useless island called Guadalcanal or something. I don't know. It couldn't be anywhere near as important as the Jewel of the Empire, surely. In any case, the stress, tropical climate, and the fact he was a 30-year-old man who'd been flying operationally for over 3 years straight with only the occasional couple of days off caused his health to basically implode, forcing him to be relieved and sent to a hospital in Bombay. As soon as he recovered, he was ordered back home to the United Kingdom for reassignment. But when he got there, he was once again shunted off into a reserve officer position at RAF Uxbridge, essentially working in administration while making sure the grass had been cut, that the guards were on duty, only throw his weight around and pull the old "do you know who I am" card. And so he literally went barging his way into the Air Ministry building in London without a security pass, demanding to see someone. And it was here that the wheels of fate turned again, because as he stormed through the building, he bumped into one of the big cheeses he'd met back in the day just out of flight school. The big cheese in question had been a wing commander back then, but he was an air marshal now. The man recognized him at once. "Hello, Czernin, what are you doing here? You look rather bedraggled, I must say." Manfred replied, "To be honest, sir, I'm a bit fed up. I haven't got a job and I'm wasting away here doing nothing." The Air Marshal looked him over, judging everything from his physique to his character as he knew it. He remembered him to be a hot-tempered, hard-charging young man, but then he also remembered his ancestry and his upbringing. Austrian born, raised in Italy, he speaks German, Italian, English, Czech. A light bulb went off, and the Air Marshal smiled deviously. For this Air Marshal in question was at the Ministry for Air Intelligence. "Czernin, tell you what, come to my office tomorrow and we'll talk. I think I may have just the job for you." Throughout the entire year of 1943, Manfred attended the SOE training establishments required to perform his role. His role being the training, organisation and leading of partisan units in Italy. The Allies had successfully taken Sicily via Operation Husky, but their campaign on the Italian mainland had run into a brick wall. Actually, they'd run into multiple brick walls, from Salerno to Anzio to Monte Cassino. Every time it appeared they were finally making some progress, the Germans would conduct a textbook fighting withdrawal to yet another layer of fortified positions running along the mountains and valleys that make up the spine of the Italian peninsula. It wasn't until June 4th, 1944 that the Allies finally captured Rome. Yet still, even with the capital taken and the Italian government changing sides, the Germans and Mussolini's loyalists still controlled the northern half of the country bordering Austria, Czechoslovakia and the Balkans. All of which, being mountainous subalpine countryside, that would take a force larger than the one now landing in Normandy to successfully liberate. Plus, it would need resources that the Allies, despite their industrial might, just didn't have. Which is where our boy Manfred comes in. With the Soviets now pushing in from the east, the bulk of German reinforcements being redirected to stop the Normandy landings, and Tito's partisans deciding, fuck it, we'll just liberate Yugoslavia ourselves, the German position in Italy, while unassailable by conventional means in the short term, was exceptionally vulnerable to an insurgency campaign. The same mountains and valleys allowing them to hold off the Allies at the front line were a double-edged sword, providing partisan units the perfect terrain to operate freely. So, if we can't take down the Germans directly, we will simply follow our new standard procedures and fund liberation organizations in the mountains to overthrow them. This is bound to succeed, and it should set a very useful precedent for us going forward into the Cold War that will never, ever backfire on us later on. Anyway, after completing his training, Manfred spent the first half of 1944 sitting at No. 1 Special Operations Section waiting for a deployment. He was very frustrated, actually, as with D-Day underway and Rome under Allied control, there was at the time a distinct sense that the war may end before he got to do the job he'd spent that past year training for. It's a rather ironic paradox that the young men we train to handle the very worst calamities that can face humankind, doctors, soldiers, firefighters, etc., subconsciously end up wanting those horrific things to occur so they can do their job and justify their existence. And after getting grounded from fighters and spending a year in training, Manfred was desperate to go on a mission. Eventually, though, he got the green light. After several false starts and abandoned operations, on June 13th, 1944, he was finally going on a mission. Now, just so you lovely listeners and viewers are aware just how dangerous this is, SOE agents usually deploy to their area of operations by linking up directly with an already active resistance unit. The way it works is a small team of resistance fighters would go out and pick out a field in a secure location and then set up a predetermined signal of some kind, usually a light flashing a Morse code message or a display set up in a field like fabric panels or flares. Once the aircraft carrying the agents sees this signal and confirms them to be correct, the pilot flies over the drop zone and gives the green light for the agents to jump. The downside to this, however, is that the enemy also knows how these operations are carried out, and if they have good intel on a drop about to take place, either from an informer or by capturing and torturing a resistance member, they can set up at the landing zone in an attempt to seize the agent on landing, from which they can then get even more operational intelligence. Hence, why the code signals are so important, to ensure that the enemy can't just set up a fake signal to trick a pilot into deploying his agents into an ambush. Something the SOE learned the hard way in Belgium and the Netherlands. On that warm summer evening in June, Manfred and his Italian partner Piero got geared up beside a B-24 Liberator of the 15th Special Bomb Group, Weapons, ammunition, explosives, radio, maps, and a supply canister filled with all of the above for the partisans. They had everything they could possibly need. So they slung their parachutes over their shoulder and walked to the plane, ready to go on their mission. However, when they got to the door of the aircraft, a hand shot out in front of Manfred's chest. "Take them off, Czernin," said the owner of the hand. "What are you talking about, Hedley, old boy?" said Manfred in response. Vincent Hedley, SOE, pointed at Manfred's shoulders. "Last I checked, you didn't get gazetted for a promotion. So why, may I ask, are you a wing commander?" Manfred smiled. "Oh, come on. What does it matter what rank I go in with? The partisans won't know the difference." Turns out, Manfred had tactically acquired some wing commander rank slides from the officers' mess and had decided to promote himself. After all, Colonel Czernin, hero of Italia, sounds a lot cooler than Squadron Leader Manfred, SOE. "You're a squadron leader, damn you, and you will deploy as one. Now take them off." Fine. Swapping them out for his original ones, which he had to run back to his room to get, he boarded the aircraft with the commanding officer slamming the door behind him, rather annoyed. Thankfully, he was dropping several hundred miles behind enemy lines, so he won't have to face him later. The B-24 fired up its engines and took off into the darkness heading north, flying towards the designated drop zone on the Italo-Austrian border. Reaching their destination a couple of hours later, the B-24 descended to the minimum safe drop height to confirm the challenge codes were correct. Except they weren't. The signal they were given at the drop point was slightly incorrect. The precise signal type was never revealed in the biography, presumably because they were classified at the time, but from witnesses to the event, the signal was mostly correct except for a couple of minor details. The pilot, noting this discrepancy, began to follow the abort procedure. But Manfred had other ideas. Knowing the Italian language and its nuances in regional dialect, especially in the northern half of the country, he thought it could simply be a miscommunication or an honest mistake. There was also the fact that several missions he had been slated to go on had been cancelled, and he was determined not to let it happen again. Plus, he'd have to face Hedley again when he landed. At this moment, Count Manfred von Czernin made his decision. Standing up from his seat in the rear of the bomber, he walked up to the crew compartment and said the following. "Bring us back around. I'm going to jump down there and find out. If all is well, I'll fix the signal." The pilot looked at him like he was insane. If it was a trap, if this was actually the Germans trying to ambush him, he was jumping to certain death. But he was also a squadron leader, and an order is an order. The B-24 flew another circuit and Manfred stood in the door. Turning to Piero, he said, "I'm going first. If it's all clear, I'll call you." And then, without another word, he jumped into the darkness. Dropping for 50 feet or so, he jerked upwards with the parachute opening, which was immediately followed by a solid impact with the ground. Low-level parachute drops are murder on the knees. Any paratroopers in the comments can confirm this. Yet he knew how to land safely after extensive training and his unfortunate experience in the Battle of Britain. After rolling to a stop and getting to his feet, he immediately began packing his parachute when he heard the distinct musical chatter of the Italian northern dialect. From a nearby tree line, partisans emerged, sprinting over to greet him. This was the group he'd been scheduled to make contact with. With that done, he signalled the aircraft to drop Piero, who subsequently arrived with the equipment canister and new gats for the boys, who were all very appreciative. Now they had to get the hell out of Dodge, and fast. An Allied aircraft circling over one field in the middle of the night could only mean one thing, and if the Germans or the fascists had noticed it, they would be there with a column of troops en route to their position within the hour. So they very quickly, but quietly, made their escape into the hills, setting up base camp on a mountain overlooking a plateau near the town of Tramonti, equidistant between the Austrian and Yugoslavian borders. This way he could coordinate resistance actions with Tito's partisans, using his charm and diplomacy to prevent the various movements from shooting at each other. After all, there are communists, Democrats, conservatives, all these different groups in the mountains, and they all hate each other. And while doing all of this, he was also organizing the other major partisan unit in the area, a group for whom he arranged supplies, equipment, and trained personally. That partisan movement were Garibaldi's partisans. And if you don't know why that's a big deal, Well, let's just say they're the guys who came into Mussolini's world and turned it upside down. So not only did Manfred yeet himself out of a plane in the middle of the night into a potential enemy ambush, which would almost certainly torture and execute him if it had been true, not only is he acting as a mediator between 3 different resistance organizations plus all their sub-factions who all hate each other, he also trained and armed the guys who killed one of the leaders of the Axis powers, and he did all of this on his first covert operation. Naturally, he got a military cross for his insane bravery on this opening phase of the mission, but his work had only just begun. Once established, his network of partisans went around raising absolute hell for the Germans, blowing up railroads, ambushing convoys, killing HVTs. He even launched several expeditions into Austria. This man led partisan missions into the Third Reich itself to cause trouble. As a result of this rather aggressive campaign, his operations came with a number of close shaves as the Germans decided to pay a bit more attention. On more than one occasion, his band found themselves engaged with an entire SS battalion, complete with tanks. Yet there were 2 incidents in particular which were exceedingly close. The first was on a mission to recon a nearby town for potential recruits and logistical support. Resistance fighters rely on support from the locals to survive. While walking down the main street talking to the locals, he ran head-on into a German patrol, who immediately asked for his papers. Confidently presenting the forged papers he'd been provided, Manfred was soon dismayed to find out that the Oberfeldwebel in charge had decided that he was guilty of a German's most reviled crime. A crime no German, anywhere, would ever accept. His papers were not in Ordnung. Detaining him as a suspected partisan, they marched him to the local police guardhouse, where he would be held pending transfer and interrogation. However, while they suspected him as being a partisan, they had no idea that he was actually a spy. An Austrian spy, who could understand everything that they were saying. Listening intently, he heard the garrison commander mention a prisoner transfer to the SS regional headquarters in Trieste for a full shakedown to try and find out where his comrades were hiding. This was a serious problem for 2 reasons. 1, it meant his cover was almost certainly blown, and certain death would follow. And 2, one of the senior officers serving in that SS headquarters was one of his cousins with the same name who knew him by sight, the 2 having met at larger family gatherings in the past. If that happened, the Germans would realize they had a British SOE agent and not some disenfranchised Italian peasant, at which point he would not only be subjected to even worse torture, he would threaten to compromise the operations of all SOE agents in northern Italy. There was no choice. He had to make a break for it. He waited until nightfall, after the guard shift had changed, and as soon as the cell opened for his meal, he rushed the guard, killing him with the hand-to-hand combat he'd been taught at the SOE training facility in Scotland. Immediately, he made a break for it. Shots were fired at him as he ran down the street, yet incredibly, he managed to get down an alleyway and into the night, successfully evading pursuit. He had gotten insanely lucky. The Germans hadn't realized who they'd caught and had gotten complacent. Though amazingly, this wasn't actually his nearest escape. No, his nearest escape came after one of his expeditions into Austria with his partner Piero. As they returned to Italy through one of the mountain passes, it was starting to get late in the day and they had been walking since sunrise. Spotting an old abandoned medieval watchtower, the pair decided to take their group and set up camp on the top floor so they could keep an eye out on the surrounding terrain. The rest of their band would guard downstairs while they got some sleep. Yet as the sun began to set, they spotted their worst nightmare. A German infantry company on an anti-partisan sweep had just finished their patrol for the day and had chosen the exact same watchtower to make camp for the exact same reasons. The partisans downstairs, having been warned of their approach by Manfred and Piero, managed to pack up their shit and make a clean getaway into the woods nearby. The 2 commanders, meanwhile, were not so lucky. As they started preparing to move, the German lieutenant leading the patrol occupied the downstairs part of the building as his quarters, while his men pitched their tents and lean-tos using the wall of the old fortification. If they were smart, or suspected trouble, they'd do what Manfred did and post a sentry on the top floor of the watchtower. And 2 men against an entire company, no matter how cool they were, is not winnable odds. Manfred and Piero drew their weapons and pointed them at the door to their little enclave. If they were discovered, it would be a fight to the death, and they knew it. There was no point in trying to be taken alive. Yet amazingly, no sentry came. The Germans apparently thought that so close to the Austrian border they were safe, and so they only mounted a light guard on the perimeter of their encampment. And after 12 endless, agonizing hours, the Germans woke up, had breakfast, broke camp, and started marching back to their base in perfect good order and discipline. None the wiser that the leader of the partisans they were searching for had been sitting 10 feet away from them the entire time. Once they had gotten far enough away, Manfred and Piero made a break for the trees, keeping the tower between them and the Germans as they did so. Against all the odds, they had managed to get away with it once again. You know something, viewers? It's genuinely ridiculous just how often Manfred managed to cheat death, considering all the extremely dangerous things he's done. Like doing the Monte Carlo rally while feverish with malaria, running safari in Africa practically unarmed most of the time, running as a partisan, fighter pilot, head-on attacks into every formation he engaged. Like, this man shouldn't have survived. Like, he just continues to cheat death. And for the rest of 1944, he continued to do so, carrying on with the mission, doing sabotage, intelligence gathering, ambushes and supply drops. And Manfred kept undertaking these insane expeditions until word came down from headquarters that he was to return to base at the end of October. Arrangements were made for the RAF to send a Lysander Army Cooperation plane to come pick him up on the 29th of that month, and so he prepared to leave. But the thing is, waiting to go home is always the worst part of a long deployment. Every soldier I've spoken to confirms this. Those last days are a killer when you've packed everything up, filed the forms, and gotten ready to hand over command to another unit. Manfred was kicking around at Resistance headquarters not doing anything except basic operational stuff. So, he decided he was going to do something he hadn't had the chance to do for almost half a year. He wanted to go to the movies. So, abandoning all caution, he put on his civilian attire, grabbed his newly forged papers that had replaced his old ones, and then he went to the nearest large town with a cinema, where he could catch the latest movies from Goebbels' propaganda machine. Paying for his ticket, he sat down in the theatre and watched an epic tale full of brave warriors and fair maidens, all perfectly normal popcorn stuff. Except there wasn't any popcorn because rationing was awful everywhere in the Axis countries. But hey, you make do with what you got. When the movie ended, though, and the lights in the theatre came back on, he found himself in one of the most insane situations imaginable, because sitting next to him was nothing less than a Wehrmacht colonel who had come to see the same movie, who immediately turned to ask him what he thought about the film. This turned into a perfectly normal conversation as Manfred naturally spoke German. The two men traded cigarettes, commented on the weather, discussed the course of the war, and it was then, through this conversation, that the German realized that this Italian spoke excellent German compared to the others around here. So he decided to ask him, "What is your nationality?" And Manfred, being Manfred, looked him dead in the eye and said in perfect Cambridge English, "Why, I'm British, old boy." The German colonel found this hysterically funny, wished him a good day, and they parted in fantastic spirits. Lies are, of course, a burden on the soul, after all. At least that's what I remember from Catholic school. After he got back to base, he pulled some strings to get a temporary assignment as a dispatch rider for headquarters while waiting for his next mission. Because if he was going to be stuck doing admin, he was going to be doing it on a sick-ass motorcycle. It also meant he could ride up to his family holiday home on the weekends. One poor Italian man hitchhiked with him once. He had no idea who he was asking for a ride. However, he didn't have a right to complain because he sure as shit got to where he was going really fast. He just needed a change of underwear afterwards. Manfred had a nasty tendency of maxing out the bike on the downhills. But of course, with the Allied forces on the advance everywhere and the Cold War starting to begin, the SOE were eager to get Italy fully clear of fascists and Western troops in all the major cities before the end of hostilities. The worsening situation in Greece and Yugoslavia saw the communist resistance movements gaining serious ground, to say nothing of Charles de Gaulle trying to prevent a French civil war in the wake of their liberation. If they didn't get this wrapped up fast, the same thing would happen in Italy. So, as soon as they got another team together, Manfred was assigned as commander for another deep operation, this time on the Swiss border in Lombardy. Things were getting serious for the partisan movements at the time due to a large contingent of the Waffen-SS under the infamous General Karl Wolff having been deployed to the region to deal with the shenanigans Manfred and his fellow SOE agents had caused the year before, resulting in heavy partisan losses. Worse still, the Allies had suffered defeat in the Netherlands due to Montgomery's Market Garden debacle, while the Americans had decided to face-tank the entire Wehrmacht in the Hürtgen Forest, only to then have to desperately cobble together a defence around Bastogne, resulting in the Battle of the Bulge. Thus, with all these military setbacks, they needed more units to relieve the heavily battered divisions coming off the line. And they got them from the so-called D-Day Dodgers in Italy. This made rebuilding the partisan movement doubly important, as they wouldn't have a main force for quite a while. Supply drops were tripled, more locals were recruited either via patriotism or literally hiring them as paid auxiliaries. And on March 21st, 1945, Manfred and his four-man team boarded another 15th Special Bomb Group B-24 and parachuted in near the town of Czernin on the Swiss border. After meeting up with the partisan group in the area on landing, they grabbed their extensive pile of equipment, found a local farmer, bought the man's donkeys off him because fuck lugging 3 mortars, 2 bazookas, 2 radios and all the ammo and batteries to go with them on foot over one of the largest mountain ranges on Earth, and then set out to their rendezvous point near the resort town of the Passo del Diavolo. Yet climbing through the mountains is a young man's game, and while I like to think that 31 isn't that old, the matter of fact is, having reached it myself, even taking into account that I'm a fat academic who sits in his office, the joints and the muscles don't just work like Todd Howard says they should, and 2/3 of the way through their journey, Manfred's feet were absolutely trashed while his knee joints were starting to swell. Now at this point his team suggested he ride one of the donkeys and have some of the younger fighters carry around the extra gear, but being a leader he wasn't going to do that to his men, he just wasn't going to have it. So, like the absolute madman he is, he walked into the nearest town to find a doctor and a place to treat his injuries. This involved walking straight into a bar full of German troops, walking right up to the barman and asking him if they have a room for the night and to phone the local doctor. He then proceeded to stay the night in town, with the entire SS police garrison having a party below him. Once they were gone the next morning, he then proceeded to hire the entire town's unemployed male population to help move their stuff from the Passo del Diavolo to a valley town just north of the city of Bergamo, named Val Brembana, which would serve as their headquarters for the upcoming campaign. And the objective of that campaign was nothing less than the capture of the entire city of Bergamo itself ahead of the Allied forces, who at that moment were preparing to launch their large-scale offensive against the remaining Axis forces in Italy, an offensive to commence on April 5th, 1945. Once the US 4th Corps and the British 8th Army started their advance, German forces in the region would move to counter them and rally the shattered units falling back, and as this all took place, the partisans would have their opportunity to sweep in and secure the major population centres, thereby avoiding a long drawn-out campaign in the mountains. It was the final month of the war, and the last thing they needed was a bloody grind to the finish. When the Allies launched their offensive, though, the resistance they faced was far lower than expected. Turns out that the fascist militias and the regular Wehrmacht forces in the region knew that the Soviets were at that very moment advancing on Berlin, and that the partisans under the command of Manfred's colleagues, as well as Manfred himself, were already swarming down from the mountains. Calculating their odds, they decided that being taken prisoner by the Brits or Americans would be a far safer proposition than a bunch of guerrilla fighters whose friends they had executed last week. So, by April 25th, 5 days before old mate Monobolok in Berlin would do what everyone had been trying to do since 1933, and blow his mind, Manfred and his partisans would start to make their move on Bergamo. The issue was, between them and their objective, black shirt militias had garrisoned several towns that they would have to clear before taking the city of Bergamo itself. The partisans had an advantage in that they controlled the terrain around the population centres, essentially allowing them to besiege the fascists inside the towns. Yet sieges take time, and towns, by the very nature of their formation, control the lines of communication in the region. Waging a full-scale campaign against a large town or city without being able to use the roads would be logistically infeasible. Thus, they would have to get rid of these fascist garrisons before taking on the SS police unit in Bergamo proper. Which leads into the next problem, that being the time and manpower expended in clearing each town. If they ran in guns blazing, it would definitely be faster than a siege, but it would still be a constant firefight for the next week at least, at the cost of 1/3 of their men, at minimum. And while this was a price they could technically afford, it was hardly the optimal choice. Manfred decided on the wiser course of action and put his most legendary skill to work. And I swear to God, I swear on my life, what follows, this entire final section of the story, is all 100% true. Which is ironic, because it is a story founded on the ballsiest example of bullshitting and bluff I have ever seen in my time as a historian. After beginning a blitzkrieg-style offensive through the nearby villages, taking down fascist patrols, police units, and securing government infrastructure, Manfred led his force of several hundred men to the first larger town on their route, the town of Zorgo. After setting up a perimeter, he went to the local post office and called the fascist garrison commander, upon which he asked his radio operator to establish a meeting to negotiate terms of their surrender. This done, he slung his submachine gun over his shoulder, grabbed his executive officer Mario, and then casually walked straight up to the fascist checkpoint guarding the town centre, leading to their barracks. He went in balls deep with no backup, saying he had an appointment. After entering the office of the fascist leader, surrounded by his lieutenants, Manfred calmly and politely demanded their surrender, explaining that he had at least 2,000 partisans in the hills around the town, and the British 8th Army on the radio, who were at that moment detaching a column to come fight through the front lines to link up with them further down the road. He then went on to say that upon surrender, the officers present would be responsible for the conduct of their subordinates, and that any insubordination on their part, regards the terms of capitulation, would be their responsibility also. At this point, the fascist officers went into furious debate with one another, loudly demanding that they should kill this Anglo and his communist minions, going down fighting in a glorious last battle in the name of Italia and their martyred Duce. Upon hearing the conversation take a turn in this direction, Manfred stared the commander dead in the eyes. What he saw was a pair of fearful eyes looking back at him, still racked with indecision. And Manfred calmly unhooked the bolt on his Sten gun with a clack. The message was clear. If you want to go out in a heroic blaze of glory, I can arrange it, but I guarantee you, you will die before I do. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. But unbeknownst to Manfred and Mario, the fascist commander had already called the SS unit in Bergamo for instructions, just before their arrival, only for no one to pick up the line. He had no idea if the Allies had already taken the city, or if the Germans had withdrawn, abandoning their Italian allies to their fate. It wouldn't be the first time, as all the fascists in the room knew. And now they had an Allied spy in their headquarters at the front of an army, staring certain death in the face, who has just unlocked the safety on his weapon. Without a word, the commander drew his own weapon, a personalized fountain pen, and presented to Manfred in writing the formal surrender of his entire command, complete with his signature. This absolute mad lad just played chicken in the enemy's headquarters and fucking won. Like, seriously, you can see why he was an absolute god at poker. But he wasn't done. Oh no, was he not done. After pulling this stunt, he then took the surrender document, walked to the same telephone he'd used at the post office, and called the next town over, the town of San Pellegrino. When the fascist garrison commander answered, he advised him of the same tactical situation that he'd relayed to the other guy, and read out the surrender document word for word, including the garrison commander's name, the name of his lieutenants, and the men he had in custody. Thus, when Manfred and his partisans arrived at San Pellegrino, they found a welcoming committee from the fascists, who immediately turned over all of their weapons, with the commanding officer handing Manfred his own sidearm personally. 2 towns and 1,000 enemy combatants disarmed, without a single shot being fired. Now came the hard part, dealing with the Germans. Linking up with the other partisan units in the area, Manfred actually had an army now. The issue was, they were also dealing with an army, namely a fully equipped SS police unit backed up by a large contingent of black shirts. MG42s, 81mm mortars, pack guns, and a couple of armoured cars. They had everything. They had the works. And with all this firepower on both sides, neither side was eager to start a pitched battle in the middle of a city full of civilians. Plus, everyone knew that the war was about to end, and to die here would just be a useless waste of a life. And as a result of all of this, an uneasy standoff had formed between the Germans in the city centre and the partisans in the outer suburbs. Under this tenuous arrangement, critical infrastructure would be preserved, so everyone could carry on normally with their daily life, with the exception of an occasional skirmish and the odd exchange of sniper fire. All that being said, SS Untersturmführer Langen was in a nasty situation, and he knew it. Eventually he would get starved out, or the Allies would show up and assault his position. In either case, there was no winning that confrontation should it occur. On the other hand, he was in charge of an SS counterinsurgency unit. These units were, as you all know, not exactly renowned for their humanitarian conduct. Surrendering to the partisans he had spent the last 2 years capturing, torturing, and summarily executing was not an exciting prospect for him or his men. Waiting for the Allies to show up was a far safer option from his point of view. The British would at least give them a trial first. Hopefully. Thus, Manfred's demand for their surrender was categorically refused. They would not accept terms. And with that decision made, back to Plan A it was. The partisans tightened their security cordon and prepared for a siege. Except at that precise moment, news came of a very serious problem. The Allied counteroffensive, as mentioned earlier, was an incredible success. The 8th Army and 4th Corps were advancing far faster than anyone had seriously expected them to. The problem was, this meant the Germans were also retreating faster than anyone had expected, which had the ever so slightly inconvenient result of an entire SS Panzer battalion, complete with Panzer Grenadiers and Panthers, falling back to their nearest friendly garrison. That garrison being the town of Bergamo. Oh dear. Manfred had to think fast. There was absolutely no way they could fight a column of Panther tanks with infantry support. They'd either have to get the garrison to surrender now, or shit will hit the fan with extreme concussive force. Manfred and Mario immediately ran around town with a squad, tactically acquiring vehicles, eventually assembling a small convoy of 3 Fiat sedans. They then draped a Union Jack over the lead vehicle and drove into the middle of the city with the intention of negotiating a surrender, only to get immediately fired upon by every German machine gunner holding security, forcing them to haul ass back to friendly lines as fast as their cars would go. Negotiation at this point was evidently off the table. All they could do now was withdraw, lest they get caught in a pincer while at the mercy of enemy tanks. Except, as you should all know by now, Manfred doesn't retreat. Nor does he give up. If there is one thing we have established throughout this story so far, it's that if Manfred hates one thing, it's losing. With his inability to secure a surrender from the German garrison, Manfred felt cheated. He was owed a surrender, and if he couldn't get one from the Germans in town, I guess he'll have to get one from the Panzer column instead. But he had to get to them before they arrived in Bergamo, and they were less than a day's march away. Hopping in their vehicles, the partisans, with Manfred in the lead Fiat, drove like maniacs across the back roads to head off the advancing Germans. However, during this mad dash, it became apparent that they wouldn't be able to get there in time using the regular roads. Manfred, though, had a solution for that. Breaking off one of the wooded country lanes, he drove cross-country. And he drove cross-country through the perimeter fence of a Luftwaffe airfield. An airfield which had, at the time, an 88mm flak battery guarding the runways. This complete lunatic was gambling that in the time it took for the Germans to react to their presence and start traversing their guns to engage them, they would already be moving too fast for them to get a shot. So these 3 Fiat sedans were hauling ass across this airfield with a pair of flak 88s traversing just behind them. And sure enough, they weren't able to get a shot. Though they did try for the last car in the convoy, but they missed wide. Safely out of range, the convoy turned down the road which the Panzer column had been reported on, only to then run straight into it. Without missing a beat, Manfred hit the gas and blasted past the Panthers, once again large caliber turrets turning to track him. Yet he held his nerve and kept his foot planted on the accelerator. The 2 leading Fiats made it out safely with rifle fire cracking behind them. The 3rd fell behind and got blocked into the convoy, the occupants tragically being taken prisoner. They had now jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. Their unit had been compromised. The Panzers were still advancing on Bergamo, and now they were behind said Panzers who were, at that very moment, on high alert. Demanding their surrender now would be a futile endeavour. The mission appeared to be a complete and total bust. Yet once again, seemingly against all the odds, Manfred had an idea. Turning to one of his adjutants, a man named Renato, he gave the following instructions. Go into the nearest town, acquire another vehicle, and drive back to the German column with a message for the commander, telling him to pull over at the next phone booth along his route of march. Manfred then went to the local post office once again, and called the local exchange, quickly getting through to the operator, who he subsequently asked to route his phone call to the various phone booths along the road the Panzer column was marching along, until eventually the Panzer Battalion commander answered one. And once this contact was established, Manfred then proceeded to bullshit the guy for a solid 5 minutes that the Americans had already taken Bergamo. He named the garrison commander, he laid out the disposition of their defenses, he accurately listed the assets based there, everything. He was basically like, seriously bro? Look, you need to understand. The lead echelon of the US 5th Army is in Bergamo right now. They have an entire division of tanks, complete with P-47 fighter bombers flying out of Corsica. Seriously, you guys need to start flying white flags right the hell now. Otherwise, you're going to get obliterated. The conversation continued until this information was relayed. And once it was relayed, the line went dead. And then they waited. And waited. And waited. They didn't know what was going on. They just had to wait and see. Sitting around on the side of the road, flowers, birds are singing, and then a radio call from the partisans back in Bergamo came through. The Panzer column had been spotted, rerouting to the northeast away from the city. This complete and utter nonsense-filled bluff had actually worked. They had successfully bullshitted on a level so transcendent that they had defeated an entire SS Panzer battalion with nothing but 3 Fiats and a phone. Having achieved this miraculous feat, Manfred and his remaining crew piled back into their vehicles and took the main roads back to Bergamo, doing a drive-by on a fascist patrol on the way. Returning to the partisan HQ, the situation hadn't changed thanks to their heroics, but the SS men inside were growing ever more restless. Worse still, on their way back they had actually taken a detour to make contact with the recon elements of the US 1st Armored Division, who were now just entering the area, only for them to tell him that their main force was still a couple of days behind them, and all they could spare were a few armoured cars. Given the Germans had Panzerfausts and an entrenched urban defence, this wasn't going to be enough. So, Manfred decided on one last roll of the dice. Calling Untersturmführer Langen, he notified him of his liaison with the Americans, advised him of the Panzer column's retreat, and then told him that the entire US 1st Armored Division was on its way at this very moment, and that he had 24 hours to offer their surrender before they marched in there and killed every last one of them. Faced with this dilemma, the SS Untersturmführer realized the hopelessness of his situation, and agreed to the surrender of the garrison on the condition that they be turned over to the Allies for imprisonment, signing documents to that effect and handing them to Manfred personally. However, he refused to hand over his sidearm in the name of human decency, for you see at that point he had decided to do the right thing, because after surrendering his men, SS Untersturmführer Langen walked back to his office and did the world a favour by following his leader. And so, on April 28, 1945, Manfred Beckett von Czernin, Squadron Leader RAF, Special Operations Executive, MC, DFC and BAR, accepted the surrender of 3,000 German troops along with the Lombardian town of Bergamo, with minimal casualties in the process. Very soon after the end of the war in Europe, the US 1st Armored Division actually arrived in the city, and a grand parade was held in the honour of the partisans and Allied troops who had fought so hard to liberate them. And the man who hosted the event, the man granted the keys to the city and labelled an honorary citizen, the only foreigner ever to receive that honour, was given the duty of the grand victory speech. The man known to the town as Maggiore Manfredi, Major Manfred. And here is a photo of that moment, SMG slung over his shoulder. The war was now over. His affairs in Bergamo set in order, Manfred decided that seeing as Italy was free now, he would go on holiday back to his old family home. He had grown up here in Italy. Seeing her proud mountain peaks and rolling vineyards liberated was a moment of joy he just couldn't pass up. He was also now the hero of the hour, so much partying, much gambling, and much, nocturnal activity was had. Yes, he is a married man, but he is also a nobleman and a secret agent. The problem with great men is they are seldom encouraged to be good ones. Then again, Maud knew what he was like when she married him, and while she didn't approve, later eventually divorcing him over his wild shenanigans, the two never really stopped loving each other and remained friends. And Manfred, despite being pure trouble, always, no matter what, prioritized his children. Though, while his wartime service had been wild enough, and if you've been listening to this video for this long, yeah, it was absolutely insane, a life full of adventure and danger, surprisingly enough, his peacetime life was one of complete and utter chaos. On the way back to his ancestral holiday home in Salerno, he passed through Rome, where he once again had a hero's welcome and played an awful lot of poker in seedy bars, getting into debt in the process. But while he was trying to dig himself out of that mess, one of the local officials said to him, "Hey, Manfredi, amici, would you like to come meet the Pope? He is meeting the heroes of the liberation." Manfred, being who he was, definitely couldn't turn that down, so he went along to the audience with the other dignitaries. When the Pope reached him in the receiving line, he talked about who he was and what he did, security permitting of course, and his background as a quasi-Italo-Austrian. The Pope, surprised at this well-dressed British officer saying he's an Austrian who had lived in Italy, then asked the important question, the most important question the Pope can ask. "Are you a Catholic, young man?" And Manfred, being Manfred, stared the goddamned Pope of the Catholic Church straight in the face and said, and I quote, "No, sir, I'm an atheist." The Pope smiled and continued down the line, though as he turned to leave, he turned his head around slightly as he did and said, "Not a smart thing to be these days." Given the health problems Manfred would later suffer, he's probably right. When he got back to England, he was constantly seeing doctors for stomach problems, lung problems, and heart problems. Turns out, chain-smoking constantly while eating scrounged-up food while climbing mountains is not good for your health, especially when you spent the decade before that ignoring having malaria while out on safari, skiing the Alps, rally racing, and then dogfighting the Luftwaffe and the Japanese for 3 years straight while drinking like a fish and still chain-smoking. Did that stop him, however? No, of course it didn't. The moment he got back, the War Ministry awarded him the Distinguished Service Order, which is, for the record, the second highest military decoration the United Kingdom can award behind the VC. With this new layer of prestige, he used this air of respectability to get a loan to go into business with an old RAF war buddy to start an air freight business in South Africa. But, like his bar in Soho before the war, it was really mainly an excuse to go flying around Africa and Europe for fun. Which they did, having a grand old time in the process. But this also meant he soon went broke and had to get more money. So he decided to try and win his fortune in the various casinos of Italy, only to run into the card sharks of the Cosa Nostra, go bankrupt and get thrown in prison, eventually having to get bailed out by his mother. Manfred went balls to the wall all over the place, trying everything, doing everything, until eventually his health collapsed entirely. After a thorough examination by medical staff in London's best hospitals, it was determined that he would need to have life-altering stomach surgery to treat the conditions caused by war-induced health complications and an unhealthy lifestyle. This was the tipping point of his life. Shortly after this, his mother, the anchor of his life, passed away from old age, leaving his ex-wife and his children the only family he really cared about left on the earth. He had to go straight. He had to get a serious job. It was time, after all these years, for him to grow up. So, in 1958, using his legendary bullshitting skills, life of the party charm, and his masterly command of European languages with a basis in Italian, he did the only logical thing. He became the official London sales representative for Fiat. That's right. After all of that, after this insane career, he ended up as a car salesman. And believe it or not, he was an absolutely incredible one. He was so good, he became the regional sales manager, and Fiat had him visiting all the trade shows in Europe as their British liaison. And this was to the extent that people in the British automotive industry started calling him Mr. Fiat. Despite all his health problems, despite everything that had happened to him, he still continued living with an absolute dynamism and charisma that all of us should aspire to. But with that dynamism came the stubborn refusal to ever relent and take it easy, when the reality was he really needed to. Constantly partying, flying and driving to automotive shows, selling cars by the thousands, long-standing member of the Lord's Cricket Ground, legendary card player, though occasionally an unlucky one, always out to dinner and always on the move. The man kept going. And one Saturday night, after a round of cards and a fantastic steak dinner, Count Manfred, Maria, Edmund, Ralph Beckett von Czernin, zu Chudenditz, DSO, MC, DFC and Bar, passed away in his sleep from a heart attack on October the 6th, 1962, at the age of 49. To anyone reading his obituary, it would seem that it had been a tragically short life for someone so incredible. A fighter pilot, SOE agent, a man who met the King and the Pope, a man of such vitality, gone too soon. Yet in that sense, I can say this with absolute certainty. When compared to most of us watching this video, he lived more than any of us ever will. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.